Hello, welcome to the video. Kick your shoes off, take a nice rest. All you have to worry about for the next 10-15 minutes or so is listening to me talk about a show called Paranormal Park, or rather Dead End Paranormal Park. So this is a pretty much brand new Netflix animated series, mostly for children. I'll talk about that in a second. It is based on a series of graphic novels called Dead Endia from author-artist Hamish Steele, which is a very good name. So immediately there's potential to draw comparisons to Hilda, which is yet another Netflix original animated series for children based on a graphic novel series from an artist based in the UK. Just sort of a funny coincidence. Also, in terms of both shows, the art direction is basically taken one-to-one from the books. So there's not a lot of translation of that style. It's more just expanding that style into, bigger environments, more detailed, whatever. And yeah, overall, this is a show that I wasn't really aware of in the run-up to release. Shortly after release, some people started talking about it over on the Patreon Discord, and I also saw it pop up in my Netflix recommendation thing, and I wasn't immediately hooked. Nothing about that preview really got me going. I just thought, okay, it looks neat, looks like a nice little kid show. And I will say from the outset that while I don't think that this is adult-friendly animation, meaning I don't think it works equally well for children and adults, it is still a show that I really, really enjoy. I have a lot of positive things to say about it. I do recommend it if it feels like it would be of interest to you. If you are a parent wondering whether or not your kid should be watching something like this, I mean, it's completely clean. I don't see any issues, anything that's even mildly inappropriate. Just to start out, I'll talk about the visuals of the show. Then I guess I'll talk about the writing, storylines and stuff without getting into any real spoilers at all, hopefully. And then close out with, discussion on representation stuff, the function that this show could serve in the contemporary landscape of children's animation, etc. So let's go ahead and get started talking about the visuals. So as I already mentioned, based on a graphic novel, pretty much the same style, especially in terms of character designs. The only potential critique, I guess, you could make here is that character designs for graphic novels, especially for kids, tend to be very simplified, and that makes sense. So they can be visually legible even when they're drawn really small in the frame or something like that. And so you could maybe argue that when translated to a TV show where you have more space, where they're larger in the frame pretty much all the time, that you wouldn't want them to be as simplistic, but I don't have an issue. I don't think they need more detail. More detail might even break the style that they're currently achieving, so that's a-okay by me. The backgrounds here I really, really enjoy. I love the backgrounds and the environments, the colors they go with, the textures. It's all still relatively simplistic. These are not hyper detailed and crazy painterly Disco Elysium backgrounds. These are just TV backgrounds, maybe on a somewhat lean budget. It is a Netflix show after all, and we know that they're not really big on spending huge amounts of money at the moment, but it still looks very good. It's relatively flat, I guess, in terms of color and shading, but then at times the backgrounds will be they'll feel like they have more depth, they do more with shadows and lighting. Again, nothing mind-blowing, but very good. A very good job. I don't even know what studio worked on this series. I think Cartoon Hangover also did a short based on the graphic novel, so maybe it's the same team there. Overall, very visually pleasant, and some of our character animations specifically are just a lot of fun. Very expressive characters. The way they move is very entertaining a lot. In particular, Norma, one of our lead characters, who's kind of a favorite of mine, is great. I love the way that she moves. She's very expressive. She gets very worked up about different things, both in terms of negative and positive reactions. It's portrayed perfectly. You would get every bit of that emotion, even if the TV was on mute, or at least most of that emotion just from the visuals. Good job. That's a good animation. And honestly, I don't have too much else to say about the visuals. I guess the other thing in terms of presentation that I could lightly touch on is the music. Not very notable in my opinion in terms of the score music for the show overall. Towards the end of the season, I don't think this is a spoiler, but they get into big musical numbers, show tune style stuff, which is very hip and has been very hip in children's animation for many years now. So not super surprising, but kind of came out of left field just in this show in particular. Those are fun songs. Those are great, but in general, the score music is nothing too much to speak of. It does its job and not much more. Okay, so I guess next we can talk about storytelling, general writing, tone, all that stuff. It's a pretty balanced show, I would say, in terms of humor and then just more genuine emotional moments or character development stuff. And overall, I think that our two lead characters, Norma and Barney, are a great pair. Like, they work really well together. They're different enough that they kind of serve as foils in certain ways, but at the same time, they're both similar in that they have things they're really, really struggling with. Those come up time and again, but not in an annoying way where you're like, oh, just get over yourself and move on. No, these are real things that a lot of people struggle with. But yeah, they're just fun to watch in general. They're very likable, which is absolutely essential. Like, if even one of them came across as unlikable most of the time, or not relatable in some way, I think it would be a tough watch overall, because we're spending basically all of our time with these two characters, sometimes in combination with a larger ensemble cast. The overall ensemble cast, like the extra characters they add, other people who work at the park, family members and stuff, all solid. Some interesting things there, lots of opportunities for interesting character interactions. And yeah, it's actually a very funny show. Even for me, I wouldn't say that it's adult humor specifically, like they're not winking at the adults in the audience so much, but generally just making funny jokes. They have just great lines in here, especially just every once in a while there's a one-liner where you're just like, that's great. That's great. That's the writing. In terms of overall story stuff, it does eventually move towards a more serious overarching story that's been hinted at since episode 1. So another thing that's very common in children's animation today, it works fine. Like, I think they do a good job of progressing into more serious stakes, I guess, more difficult challenges for our lead characters. Also, just in terms of like content, themes, motifs, and all that, this absolutely fits into a subgenre of children's animation, which I guess we can call paranormal children's animation. And like, yeah, paranormal's right there in the title, but there are tons of other shows that have had a similar tone, have used similar subject matter or story elements. So stuff like Over the Garden Wall, absolutely. Gravity Falls, 100%. The Ghost of Molly McGee. It's more or less real world stuff, but then they inject these paranormal elements just for some fun. There may be ghosts, there may be spirits and monsters and mysteries and intrigue. I think it works very well. I would have more of a problem with it if each of these shows felt like very similar to one another, if they felt like copycat shows, but they really don't. I think basically every one of them feels very distinct. Dead End in particular, yeah, it feels like its own thing. Our main setting, in fact, is just this theme park. Theme parks are fun. It has all these weird mysteries and like secrets to it. There are the crazy underground tunnels. There's just a lot of fun elements here, and the show in general does a good job of striking that tone of like, we're gonna have some sort of spooky imagery, but it never really tips too far into like Courage the Cowardly Dog territory, or like a show that's straight up for adults that's just really horrifying. No, it rides that line very well. I think it gives kids a taste of horror elements, but ultimately all of that stuff serves as metaphor or allegory, I guess, for character problems, things that they're dealing with and things that they're trying to work through. And the last thing to talk about is how the show handles representation. The show is also being promoted, I think, as an example of positive representation. That's Netflix put it in, whatever they call it, the Representation Matters collection or something. Some of the marketing copy for the graphic novel says like, complete with talking pugs, vengeful ghosts, and LBGTQIA love. So like, it's very open about these elements, and I think especially for some of us grown-ups, we've lived through this huge transition towards outright attempts to include lots of representation and diversity along many lines: racial, ethnic, gender identity, and we've seen it done cynically so many times, and done so poorly, often by Disney themselves. I think that's made a lot of us jaded, even a lot of us who really support the idea of positive representation and diversity in media. Like, it's very important, but it's done poorly so often, and when it's done poorly, it can feel very cynical. It can feel like trendy, like, oh, we just want to have these elements so that we look better. It's a PR thing. It's not because they actually wanted to include this stuff in the piece of media. Here, no, I think it's a pretty darn good example of really just natural and smooth and well executed representation. Another one that I can go to just right off the top of my head is a show like Kipo, where it doesn't treat these elements as like special or strange or like as a source of anxiety, especially in that post-apocalyptic setting. I understand my identity. Here's who I am. I'm just part of the show. It doesn't stand out, which can be a big problem. Like, you just want these characters to be treated like characters. They have an equal amount of dignity, right? You don't want them to feel like they're being flown on the flag, like, look, we have this kind of character in our show or movie. Here in this case, like, it is closer to the real world scenarios where Barney is extremely just anxious about identity. It's a huge issue, and that's realistic. Like, that's absolutely still a thing that many people have to actually deal with. I appreciate that that was done well. Outside of Barney, we have other instances of representation in other ways, and none of it stood out to me. None of it stood out to me as try-hard or corny. It fits. It fits the show. It fits the tone of the show, the environment, the subject matter, and I really, really appreciate that. I do think it's a pretty darn good example of how to do representation effectively. And honestly, that's probably about everything. Those are my general thoughts on the show so far. Again, not getting into more specific story stuff and spoilers. Maybe I could get into that later if this video does really well or something. For the meantime, that's what I think of Dead End Paranormal Park, and I do hope it gets more seasons. Who knows what's going on at Netflix these days in terms of their animated production and all that. I have my fingers crossed. I do like this bunch of characters, and I'm sure that I'll be rewatching some of it in the future. But please let me know what you think and whether you had a good time with it, etc. But that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.